So there are a number of different, pitfalls of experimental design, including, some really rather interesting effects that can influence the outcomes of, various experimental studies. One of them is, very famous. It's called the placebo effect, which means I will please, right? And basically, it's the idea that if you offer something, some kind of therapeutic intervention, but there is no actual clear, well-defined sort of mechanism. Yet if the person actually, the subject receiving this intervention really believes that it's going to be effective, oftentimes there is an effect, even if, what you're giving is, let's say, a sugar pill, right? Where there's no direct, drug action. The sugar isn't doing something specific to directly address, the issue at hand. Oftentimes, this is couched in the discussion of a placebo given to, reduce pain, for example, right? And, the experimental group would get morphine and then the control group would get this placebo, right? Like a sugar pill of some sort. And yet the very act of giving, something that a subject is told will have an influence, a positive influence over their circumstances, has real actual benefit. I mean, they will report, some effect. And it's really kind of interesting because, there is no drug involved, in some of the, especially in the realm of pain relief. You think about opioids and how, those drugs have resulted in horrific, dependence, drug use disorders, opioid use disorders, and also, many, hundreds of thousands of Americans dead. So, the idea that a sugar pill, something without that kind of, dangerous impact on the body and brain might actually also be, potentially therapeutic is really interesting. So what's interesting is that the placebo effect is, actually quite real. It's if you receive something with the expectation that it's going to provoke an improvement, well, already you're going to be altering how your brain is functioning. And also there may be changes, that result directly in the body as well. You may be, relieved that there's a therapeutic intervention that may be effective. You will be maybe attending less to the pain in the expectation of it resolving, for example, sooner. You have, the social support and, the fact that somebody has actually reached out and offered care and assistance in a particular circumstance, may be sufficient to produce, a rather powerful reduction in your pain or your, unpleasant circumstances. So the placebo effect is really very, very powerful. There's a famous study that was done, looking at, patients with ulcer pain. And ulcers are, damage to the lining of the stomach, actually. They used to be thought that they were just directly caused by stress, etc. But it turns out that the stress may predispose to the development of ulcers, but it's actually a particular kind of bacterium called H. pylori, which we have a microbiome in here, right, with a whole host of different organisms and flora and fauna, and the health of this microbiome we're seeing more and more is critical for mental health as well, and for preventing the development, for example, of ulcers. And under certain circumstances, there's a particular bacterium called H. pylori, which can, basically dramatically increase in number and cause these ulcers, which lead to significant pain. And they found that if they had somebody who the subject trusted significantly, at the time, this was in the 1970s, they had a doctor who would come, white coat, say this is our frontline treatment for ulcer pain, and you take this, and 99.9% of people experience significant relief within a couple hours or something. Well, a large number of those patients who were suffering from real ulcers and significant pain, reported significant declines in their pain. Well, if they had at the time, they said it was a nurse in this particular study, although to many people, like, a nurse is somebody they may trust significantly more than the doctor who sees you for such a brief period of time. But anyway, they would have somebody with less authority, they claimed in the paper, suggest that this is an experimental treatment that it hasn't proven very effective. Some drug rep just dropped it off in our office, and it's not something we would necessarily recommend. And it was also the same placebo, the same sugar pill. And in those cases, very few of the individuals reported any improvement in their symptoms. So the placebo effect, I just wanted to make it clear that it's a very powerful impact, and it's dependent on actual effects on the body and brain. There are neurobiological underpinnings to what's going on, expectations, and trust, and it could be like if you get finally some kind of an effort, some kind of a social effort to improve your circumstances, that can significantly reduce stress responses and make you, feel better already just from that kind of an experience. We'll talk more about, various aspects of the placebo effect, because it's actually quite fascinating. Like, the larger the pill that they give you, the bigger the effect. There's certain colors that seem to work for certain kinds of, placebo effects, etc. And the other kinds of pitfalls of experimental design also include something called the nocebo effect, which is actually the sort of opposite. Like, if somebody gives you something that they claim may significantly worsen your outcome, well, if you trust their judgment and you believe in their expertise, well, you may actually experience some negative consequences. And I want you to think about that in terms of, for example, the consent forms, which are so essential for participating in research, in human research these days. But they often list all of the different potential negative consequences of participation in that research study. Like, you think about a bottle of pills and the side effects that are listed on the side. Like, if you're about to take a drug for your pain or something like that, and it says there's a risk of nausea from consumption of this drug, well, automatically you may start paying more attention to your gut, and you may be predisposing yourself to the experience of nausea. There's also something called the experimenter expectancy effect, and this is a really critical pitfall, where if the experimenter knows whether you're in the control group, let's say getting a placebo, or you're in an experimental group, let's say getting a drug, they may actually interact with you differently and record data differently, and basically act differently in the expectation that you'll be experiencing some sort of improvement, if they know you're in the experimental group. So to combat that, we typically have what we call double-blind experiments, where neither the subject nor the experimenter, that's the double blindness of this, are aware of which particular treatment group you're in, which particular experimental group you've actually been placed in. And finally, there is something called the Hawthorne effect, which we described earlier too, right? Which is the tendency for people to act differently if they know they are the subjects of research. This was also called reactivity. It was, based on the Hawthorne electric plant, right, where they, experimenters reduced the light levels, and they told everyone, that they were going to be measuring productivity as the light levels decreased. And because people knew that they were actually engaged in being evaluated in this experimental setting, they actually increased their productivity as the light levels declined. So, again, that's something that's often very difficult to address. People who, read the consent form, they're aware of all the potential risks, hopefully, and they are aware that they're actually, in an experimental, circumstance. They may be acting differently because of all those factors. And that's maybe not, the best judge, right? So these are some of the pitfalls, that are encountered in experimental design.